Hello, family. How are you doing today? So excited to be back on another airing of Dr. Sumner's Summit to Wellness. Really happy to chat with you guys again today. We are going to talk about a topic that seems so confusing and slightly ambiguous, and for some people even seems like a myth or a fad. And I really don't believe that it is. I think that this is a topic that really needs to be discussed and hopefully discussed productively, because it's a real issue and a lot of people are suffering from it. And sadly, not enough of us know about it. So today we're going to be chatting about celiac disease, and we're going to chat about this catch-all term that we hear a lot called gluten. Have you guys heard of gluten? What in the world is gluten? Does anyone know? I'd love to hear from you what you think gluten is. It's funny, I think Jimmy Kimmel did like some special on it not that long ago, a little skit, and he asked people, what is gluten? A lot of people were eating these gluten-free diets, and no one could really define what in the world gluten even is. So if someone can let me know before I tell you in the comments section what gluten is and you get it right, then you will get a prize from me. You will get a copy of my free book, a free copy of my book. So let me know, the first person to guess what gluten is. And don't cheat, don't look it up on Wikipedia or Google, guys. All right, so for those of you who don't know, I'm Dr. Felicia Sumner. I'm your board-certified family medicine physician and wellness strategist, and I break down the massive wall between doctors and patients to get to the root cause of disease. It is so important to me to be able to do that, and I do this through my online health education platforms and my direct primary care practice so that you can live your best life, because you deserve to be well, whole, energized, and loving life. So this month, for those of you who weren't aware, May is, aside from many other things, May is Celiac Awareness Month. So I think, again, that's why it's pretty important for us to have a discussion about this whole thing called celiac disease. And this word gluten, it's become such a buzzword, especially in the past couple of years, largely because of this popularity of the gluten-free diet. So that's why I think before you even consider trying this diet or consider keeping on this diet, let's first talk about what gluten is and whether or not it can negatively impact your own body or your health in the short term or the long term. So let's see, did anyone guess what gluten is? Here is gluten. It's a type of protein, okay? A type of protein, and it's composed mostly of two major molecules called glutenin and gliadin, okay? Glutenin and gliadin. And these molecules, they actually form an elastic bond together with water. And so the big component of gluten is that it's really adhesive. It basically it's gluey. And that's actually where the term gluten comes from. It comes from the Latin, it's a Latin derivative. It's the Latin word for glue. So that's why, it causes these doughy kind of textures in your cakes and your breads and things like that that allow the bread, the spongy texture to hold together, okay? So even though it does wonders for foods, it makes your pretzels and your cakes and your cookies and your breads taste really yummy and fluffy, unfortunately, it does not do wonders for our body. In fact, it can even be very harmful for some, if not many of us. So why? Why? So did any of you guess that? Did any of you guess gluten's right? For the first person, I will let you know you will get a free copy of my book, Fill Your Cup, which is an awesome book. So check it out. I'll drop the link below as well. So what does gluten do for your body? Why is it such a problem? A big part is that gluten, it has a tendency to basically block or impede the nutrient breakdown and the absorption from your foods, whether, those foods themselves have gluten or not. Gluten contains certain chemicals or toxins that impede your ability to take in the important nutrients from even other foods that you eat. So it might lead to improper digestion. It can lead to what's called a leaky gut. Eventually, the undigested gluten, it builds this immune reaction to attack the villi, which are these finger-like hairs, basically, that line your intestine, and it can lead to side effects like diarrhea, constipation, nausea, abdominal pain. And if you're eating a lot of gluten or an excessive amount of gluten, it can even lead to further damage of your small intestine, causing like inflammation, which could predispose you to not being able to absorb nutrients, have anemia, osteoporosis, other psychological diseases, even skin, liver, joint, nervous system issues as well. And I'm even talking about the people who have not been diagnosed with this disease called celiac disease, which we'll get into a little more. So first, let's chat about what are the three main categories. If you expose yourself to this protein called gluten, what are your potential reactions or responses to gluten? One is that you could have complete gluten tolerance, meaning that you eat anything with gluten and you never have a problem. If you're one of those lucky folks, kudos to you. Believe it or not, there's not that many of us out there that don't react to gluten in some particular way. Category number two is if you have what is called celiac disease, which is basically an autoimmune reaction. Your body, you have a self-immune reaction to gluten. So you ingest gluten, something that contains that protein gluten, and then your immune system will attack the gluten, and in essence, unfortunately, as a side effect to that, end up attacking other organ systems in your body, which we'll get into a little more. So that's category number two. So category number one is you're completely tolerant. Category number two is you have celiac disease. And the other category number three, which we're not as familiar with, even as conventional doctors or physicians, is what's called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or otherwise known as gluten intolerance. Can someone put that in the comments for me? Non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So those are the three categories. You're either tolerant, you've got celiac disease, or you're non-celiac gluten sensitive. Those are the three potential reactions to ingesting gluten. So let's quickly get into what is celiac disease. Has anyone heard of that disease before? Have you been, or a loved one dealt with celiac disease? Interestingly, it was discovered like back in the 1950s, and the way that it was discovered was by this pediatrician. He had eventually noticed that a lot of his patients, and even adults, were getting malnutrition, their growth was stunted, they were getting cancers, even psychiatric illnesses, even death. And eventually he realized the connection between those people that were ingesting gluten and having these reactions leading to these, issues. And so that's how he discovered it. Since then, unfortunately, the problem is mainstream medicine, mainstream health societies have been saying that it's either black or white. You've either got celiac disease or you have no issues with gluten. And that's really not the case. There's a lot of people who are in that in-between of the spectrum called this non-celiac gluten sensitivity issue. It's not an all or nothing thing. And the fact that we are getting it wrong in some of these cases is what's hurting a lot of people. So there are a lot of different shades to being gluten intolerant, okay? Wheat, it contains several different types of proteins, okay? Gliadins and glutenins are the two main components of what's in gluten, okay? And interestingly, when your doctor, if say you went to your doctor and you were concerned that you might have celiac disease, if they're in agreement with that being a possibility or them testing it for you, they usually they'll run a particular blood test in most cases. Even though technically the gold standard for diagnosing celiac disease is actually a biopsy of your small intestine, But most doctors aren't going to want to put you through all of that. So they may run this blood test, okay? And the way to diagnose it is they will check for two particular types of antibodies, because as we said, celiac disease is an autoimmune disease, which means that your body builds these antibodies to attack gluten whenever you ingest it. So the two main tests that most conventional doctors learn about, including myself, are what's called anti-gliadin and anti-transglutaminase 2. Those are the two main antibodies that most conventional labs will check for when you are concerned for celiac disease. The problem, though, is that gluten contains a lot more types than just the alpha-gliadin and the transglutaminase 2. Those are the two types we test for, but there's actually not only alpha-gliadin, there's beta-gliadin, there's gamma-gliadin, there's omega-gliadin, okay? And there's even more what's called glutenins. And all of these things, there's gliadorphins and all these other components and classes of proteins that your body could be reacting to that we don't even test for. So the big thing to understand is that celiac disease, it's characterized by this immune response to a specific type of gliadin, alpha-gliadin, and a specific type of transglutaminase, which is another epitope called transglutaminase 2. But the issue is we now, from a lot of studies, know that people can and they do react to a bunch of other components of wheat and gluten, including other types of gliadin, deamidated gliadin, other types of transglutaminase, even type 3 and type 6, which is in the skin and the brain, respectively. So there's a whole bunch of different type of epitopes or types of this gluten protein that we are not testing for. So this is a huge problem. If you may possibly still have celiac disease. You may possibly be tested for celiac disease. You may even have the symptoms. If you are testing negative, it either means you don't have celiac disease or you may have it, but we did not test for the right type of antibody. We didn't test for the particular epitope of antibody that you may be having an immune reaction to. Does that make sense? Have any of you had issues like that where you're pretty sure, you eat wheat and barley, rye, oat products, you eat things with gluten, and you know good and darn well that you are having a reaction, but your doctor has checked for celiac disease and they say that you're fine, it's negative, but if you stay away from gluten, you feel great. Well, that may be your answer. That may be why, because you are having an immune reaction to an antibody that the conventional labs cannot pick up, okay? So there is a subset of people who have celiac disease, and we are not picking them up or diagnosing them with the current conventional test, okay? Another big point is that there's a huge range of symptoms and conditions that are linked to gluten sensitivity or gluten intolerance. So celiac disease, that's one way that you react to ingesting gluten. The other one, like I said, is you're completely tolerant. You don't have any problems with it. You can eat all the breads, pastas, oatmeals, whatever you want, and you never have an issue. Then there's this other subset of people that are non-celiac gluten sensitive. And those people can have a whole bunch of symptoms. A lot of them, you might have the constipation, diarrhea, belly pain, bloating. And then there are actually a number of people who don't have any of those GI symptoms, but you have other symptoms related to ingesting gluten, like fibromyalgia. There's a correlation between that. You might have skin rashes that develop from ingesting gluten. You might have what's called neuropathy, like numbness, tingling, and itchy feeling in your hands, feet. There have been links to gluten intolerance and schizophrenia or depression or ADHD, autism. You might develop some insulin resistance or inflammation because of your intolerance to gluten. So there's a bunch of other ways that your gluten sensitivity or intolerance can manifest itself, okay? There's an estimate that people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, it could be as high as like 0.5% of the US population to as high as like 13% of the population might have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and even more than that. And the reasons why our estimates are so wide and could be even more than 13% is because, number one, like I said, the current tests that we have, they're really limited. There's about 30 different types of gliadin, transglutaminase, wheat molecules or proteins that you can have a reaction to that unfortunately we don't test for with conventional testing. Another reason why it's underdiagnosed is because even the blood test, if you get the best blood test, the ones from the super specialized lab that can handle these 30 proteins and test for them, even those tests are not 100% accurate. Okay, so we'll talk about what's the best way to diagnose if you're gluten sensitive in just a sec. Doctors, why it's so underestimated is that even when the doctors and the patients suspect it, it's usually when you have some kind of digestive symptom. But the issue is that, as we said, a lot of the symptoms related to gluten sensitivity are not gut symptoms at all. They can be skin, they can be, brain related, with regards to your mood or any psychiatric disorder. It can mess with your nerves, things like that. So there's a lot of studies that are saying that about 30% of patients who are newly diagnosed with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, they don't have any kind of gut symptoms, or their gut symptoms are pretty silent, so you wouldn't even know it, okay? So that I think is pretty interesting as well. So if you really think about it, the issue is that celiac disease, it's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to being gluten intolerant, because celiac disease, it's this distinct autoimmune response to these wheat proteins and these transglutaminase enzymes, but it's just one possible expression of gluten intolerance. And there are many other ways that you can be or show that you're sensitive to gluten, and there are many other ways that it can manifest, and that's why we need to understand the importance of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, okay? The tough part is there's no great consensus on the definition of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, but the most common way to understand it is basically it's a reaction to gluten that resolves or gets better when gluten is removed from the diet and when celiac disease or an allergy to gluten have been ruled out. So that's the best way to define non-celiac gluten sensitivity. The crazy thing is that with celiac disease, if you have an autoimmune response or even if you have gluten intolerance, it can affect, like I said, every tissue in your body, your brain, your skin, your endocrine system, so possible development of type 1 and type 2 diabetes, your stomach, your liver, your blood vessels, your muscles, even all the nucleuses of your cells. It can cause this major issue with gluten intolerance. And so you might end up, actually, we found that a lot of people have what's called Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, or an issue with low functioning thyroid or hypothyroid. And it's because there's something called molecular mimicry. The same kind of antibodies that develop when you eat gluten may also develop when you and attack your thyroid tissue. So meaning that your gluten molecules to your body or immune system may look very similar to your thyroid molecules. And so if you ingest gluten and your body has a reaction to it, not only will you try to attack and build inflammation because of the gluten, but those antibodies can also end up attacking your thyroid because they think that your thyroid molecule is gluten. So that's crazy. And then another piece to this that definitely needs to be kept in mind is for some people, you can even develop what's called a cross-reactivity. And what that means is that you may develop an immune response to gluten, and eventually some of the gluten molecules may look like dairy molecules, for example, to your body. And dairy molecules may cross-react with gluten. So that means that even for some people, if you get rid of gluten entirely out of your diet, but you're still eating dairy or ingesting dairy, you still may have a reaction because your body now mistakes dairy for gluten. And that's called cross-reactivity. So again, it can't be this all or nothing approach, this everyone same approach. It has to be very personalized because all of our bodies, we've been made and developed so intricately by our Creator that we all may react to certain things very, very differently. So here's the big question. For those of us who are not tolerant, and it's tough to know that, right? Because you may not have any GI symptoms, but say you're tired all the time, or you've been getting these, things that look like eczema on your skin, or, you've been having this brain fog. Could it be related to gluten? Could you have a gluten intolerance that has not yet been diagnosed? Is it possible? So the question is it dangerous for you to remove gluten from your diet? My answer to that is no, because believe it or not, we have not had gluten in our diet from the time that the good Lord created us. Gluten has only really been introduced to the human diet about 11,000 years ago or so. Okay, and that's actually a very tiny fraction of how long human beings have been on this earth. That's like about 350 plus generations compared to 66,000 generations since we've been on this earth. So we've actually evolved in an environment where we used to have no gluten and we used to have no cereal grains, and now we've been eating them a lot, right? And so the huge problem is that whole grains, which are mostly the things that contain gluten, they're actually not very nutrient dense. They don't actually have that many great nutrients with it. Even when they say, stay away from the white breads, white pastas, white rices, eat whole wheat, whole brown rice, whole grain bread, whole wheat pasta. And we assume that we're eating so much healthier when we do that. And of course that contains, unfortunately, a lot of gluten. The real truth to that is that if you compare it to other foods, whole grains, if you compare it to other foods like organ meats, fish, meats in general, vegetables, fruits, whole grains are actually like at the bottom of the list. And of course, refined grains like flour are even lower than whole grains. But it's interesting because 85% of the grain consumed in America is the highly refined form. And that accounts for like 20% of our calories in the average American. Whole grains contain, that's for a discussion for another day probably, what's called phytates and lectins. These are all components that help the grain or the seed of the grain defend itself from being eaten, and actually allows us not to absorb the bit of nutrients that it does have. So that's, again, a discussion for another day. But whole grains, unfortunately, are not even all they're cracked up to be, to really be totally transparent here. So the big thing is that, is avoiding gluten dangerous? No. The big thing is, though, when you are attempting to have a gluten-free diet, it does not mean to replace all of your gluten-containing foods with the boxes and the bags that you see in the supermarket aisles that's labeled gluten-free. That whole lovely gluten-free aisle that's sitting in the middle of the organic aisle, and so you throw a lot of those into your cart and you think you're good and now you're healthy and you'll be okay. But what happens is you're replacing all of those, what should be nutrient-dense calories, with junk food in its place, and that's not the ideal situation. What you should do, if possible, is replace those gluten-containing foods with nutrient-dense foods like more plants, more fruits, more vegetables, more meat, more fish. Those are the kind of things that you want to replace it with, as opposed to more gluten-free crackers, more gluten-free bread, more gluten-free cookies, gluten-free chips, gluten-free donuts, gluten-free cake, gluten-free bagels. Those are unfortunately not doing you any justice. So really the best test for gluten intolerance, we talked about testing in the blood. The problem with that is that we lose about 28 of the possible components that you should test for. And so a lot of people end up negatively testing when they really are celiac disease or gluten sensitive. The best test is actually for you to remove gluten from your diet for at least 30 days, okay? That is the best test. I would also recommend, please discuss that with your doctor. Mention it to your doctor. I'd like to take a gluten-free challenge. And what you would do is remove gluten from your diet for 30 days and then reintroduce it. And if you are having symptoms after those 30 days that you noticed you didn't really have during that 30-day period, then that is a pretty strong sign that you are indeed gluten sensitive. Or you may in fact have celiac disease that was not yet diagnosed. But you certainly are likely gluten sensitive if you take the gluten-free challenge and you develop symptoms after you reintroduce gluten to your diet. Okay? So even though there's the biopsy, which is the gold standard, we've got these blood tests, the real gold standard is this gluten-free challenge, okay? And again, it really needs to be in coordination with your physician or your healthcare provider, okay? We, unfortunately, as doctors, I will have to admit, many of us do not pay as close attention to this middle ground, this non-celiac gluten sensitive possibility as much as we should. And so I think it's really important that if you are concerned you might have any sensitivity to gluten, discuss it with your doctor. They likely will not object to you avoiding gluten for 30 days. For some people, it even has to be 60. But again, you need to coordinate that with your doctor. It usually takes about 2 weeks and up to 30 days for some people to flush gluten out of your system. Keep that in mind. So even if you stop eating gluten, it doesn't mean that tomorrow you're going to feel all that better. It could be up to 2 to 4 weeks for you to really flush gluten out of your system and then be able to notice any symptomatic difference. And many times you won't really notice if there's a difference until you reintroduce it and realize, oh shoot, I'm kind of foggy, or oh, I'm feeling this pain that I didn't have for the last 2 weeks. I didn't even realize that I didn't have pain for the last 2 weeks. So that's a big part of it, okay? So it's definitely worth pointing out too that people that are intolerant of gluten, you may also be intolerant of other food proteins like dairy, eggs, and even coffee, okay? Again, because of this cross-reactivity issue. So personally, for me, my patients, if I'm concerned for gluten sensitivity or celiac disease, I would recommend a completely grain-free, completely dairy-free diet during this gluten challenge period, so that we can really eliminate all of the possibilities and reintroduce slowly over time. So what did you guys think about that information? Was it helpful? Are you concerned that you might be gluten intolerant? How did you find out if you were gluten intolerant? Please share. Definitely join our Be Well Facebook group. I will drop the link below. We talk about these things and much more in our group in efforts to make sure that you are feeling and being well, whole, energized, and loving life, because there's so many hidden little pieces to our health that unfortunately aren't in mainstream. Our doctors, myself included, we don't always talk about it or know about it in the upfront. And so sometimes we have to be prompted by our patients because everyone deserves a personalized and individualized approach to their health. We just need to be better educated. So that is my hope, that you got something from this information today. And if you did, please share it with your loved ones, your family, on your Facebook pages, so that someone else can do and feel better. Someone else can do and feel more well, because you deserve it. Definitely join our Be Well Facebook group. Again, I'll drop the link below. And if you have any questions, feel free to message me. I'm here in hopes to help you get closer along on your wellness journey. It was great speaking with you guys as usual. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.